Hello, and welcome to this last of the series of life science lessons on the history of life. And what we're going to do today is we're going to revise the different aspects of the history of life and then have a look at some sample questions to give you an idea of how questions on this section are actually asked. If we have a look at this concept map, which covers the section is called the History of Life. And in previous lessons, we looked at fossils, what they are, how they occur. Then we looked at the history of the Earth and how things changed over time. Then we took a look at the geological time scale and how it illustrated the Cambrian Explosion. Then we looked at mass extinctions, and I'm going to revise all of those today, and we're going to have a look at some revision questions. First thing we need to revise is the process of fossilization, and this is one of the sections that you will actually need to be able to write down as a paragraph to explain how fossilization occurs, starting with death, decay, burial, sedimentation, covered with lots of sediments, mineralization, minerals replaced by minerals from the groundwater, so it truly becomes a fossil because a fossil is made of stone, and then that fossil needs to be exposed so that we can know about it and investigate it. Then there are different types of fossils. First of all, the most common type of fossil is the body fossil, where you're actually looking at what the animal looks like, and that is made from the hard parts of the body. It can be mineralized. That's one of the methods, and that is what happened in this particular fossil. It can be carbonized, and it would then form coal, or it could be preserved in resin or tar or ice, and this is an example of amber, which is an insect which was trapped in resin, and it has now been turned to rock. Those are the body fossils. Then we also find molds, which is where the organism dies. It's covered by sediment, and then it decomposes. So the only thing left is its shape, and the shape is as a hollow in the rock. It's not the actual animal that was there. Then, if that hollow gets filled with sediment, a cast is produced, which has the outer shape, but none of the inner structure. And the last type of fossil is the traces that animals leave behind, things like footprints, burrows, and their droppings. Next thing is, how do we know how old the fossils actually are? And what scientists do is they date the rock in which the fossils are found. And there are two ways that fossil dating can occur. First one is called relative dating. And in relative dating, it's simply the older layers are at the bottom and the younger layers are at the top. This just tells you which fossil is older than which other fossil. It doesn't actually give you a number. The second one, the one that is accurate, scientifically accurate, is absolute or radiometric dating, and here scientists can work out the actual age, give or take a couple of million years, using radioactive elements, which all have what is called a half-life. And I know this section is confusing, but for scientists it's quite simple. They measure the radioactivity of the rock, and they use a graph like this. So if there is so much radioactivity, let me get back to where we were. Okay, if there is so much radioactivity, they would then say, aha, if it's 50% radioactivity, it is so many years old. And the scientists that make up the curve like this, they know exactly what they're doing. So all the scientists need to do is simply measure the radioactivity, and it's quite easy to actually find out the approximate age of the fossil. Sometimes questions are actually asked using this information, and we're going to have a look at one question now, see how questions are asked. Okay, so we start off, study the table, and that is showing how the decay of carbon-14 occurs over time. Okay, and the key thing is the number of half-lives that have elapsed. It also tells us how many years ago. For example, 1 half-life is so many years. 2 half-lives is so many years. And if you have a look, it's actually just double that. If we have a look at this, it's that figure added to that figure. So if we had to work out what x is, how would we know what x is? We would take 22,920, add 5,700, and we would actually be able to get the value of x. Okay, now let's have a look at the questions. First question says, name 2 methods used to determine the age of fossils. And here you would have to talk about, or you would have to write down relative dating and absolute or radiometric dating. Then the next one is calculate the value of x, and then calculate the value of z. Now, x, it's quite easy because you add 5,730 years every time. But how does the bottom one work? 100, 50, 25. How do we get there? We are halving it each time. So z would be half of 6.25. Let's have a look. Okay, and those are exactly the correct answers that we worked out by looking at the table. Then the last question was explain why it would not be possible to date an 80 million year old fossil. And if you look at the table, it's because at 80 million years, there would be no carbon-14 remaining in the fossil. And that's why carbon-14, because it has a short half-life, can only be used to date materials probably in about the last 50,000 years. Okay, so what we've done up till now is we have looked at fossilization and how fossils are dated and the different types of fossils. I think we need to take a break. Welcome back. I hope your brains haven't been fossilized, because we're going to spend a bit more time looking at fossils and what they tell us about the history of life on Earth. If we look at the concept map, we've already looked at fossils. We're going to look at the history of the Earth, the geological timescale, and the Cambrian Explosion to see how they all work together to give a picture of what life was like in the past. We started off with this example of a timeline starting 4,600 million years ago and ending now. And we looked at how conditions on Earth changed and also when the very simplest cells first arose. Over the past billion years, lots of things have changed. The continents have moved. The temperatures have gone up and down, leading to tropics and ice age conditions. Sea levels have risen and fallen, and the levels of different gases in the atmosphere have risen and fallen. And this has affected the animals which could live in those particular conditions. Right at the top, 550 million years ago, there was something called the Cambrian Explosion. And that was when life on Earth diversified, became very, very different, starting the development of the wide variety of living things that we see on Earth today. If we have a look at this picture, this is showing us the eras: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. Here are the pictures of some of the fossils found at the different depths, and these are the names of the different periods. You will notice that in the Cenozoic era, there are also different periods, but you don't need to know the names of those. Now, looking at a geological timescale, we looked at this particular one. Before 550 million years ago, we call the pre-Cambrian time, and then the three different eras: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, with pictures of all the different animals and plants that lived on Earth at that particular time. The pictures give you an idea, and if you have a look and you compare the living things here with the living things there, it's very, very different. And the next thing is, well, why did it become that different? Okay, so if we look purely at the Paleozoic era, if we look all the life forms here, right at the bottom, mainly invertebrates. And the invertebrates were first found in water, and then they later moved onto land. Then, if we have a look at the end of the Paleozoic here and the Mesozoic here, you can see that vertebrate animals started appearing. You had fish-like structures, then reptiles, and the fish, of course, were in the sea, but the reptiles then moved onto land. And in the Cenozoic era, the dominant form of life was mammals. So the Cenozoic era is called the Age of Mammals, and mammals dominate the Earth today. Next question. How do they ask questions on this? Are you expected to know all these names and which animals are found where? And the answer is no. You do not have to memorize their geological timescale. You need to know the names of the three eras. Any other information, you would be given a geological timescale with some information on it, with perhaps pictures, and you would have to use the source material, use the picture in order to be able to answer the questions. So questions on this are mainly interpretation questions. Okay, so first question, quite easy. What does MYA stand for? And obviously, million years ago. Then the second one is have a look, and when did the Triassic period start? So you would have a look here and you would say, right, this is where the Triassic period started, and you will be able to pick up the answer. So, answer, MYA is a million years ago, and the Triassic period started 251 million years ago. Then, next one also can be answered simply looking at the geological timescale. Which era and period are we living in? And we look here, they talk about humans, and that is the Quaternary period and the Cenozoic era. Remember, the spelling of Cenozoic can vary. Don't let that upset you. Then, other questions could be asked where you would have to calculate. It says, how long did the Ordovician period last? So you would have to find the Ordovician period, which is here, and it's from 488 to, or 500, minus 440, and that gives you about 60 million years. When you have to read it off the graph, they'll always give you a little bit of leeway of a couple of million years. Then, questions involving interpretation. In which geological period did the amphibians first appear? Sometimes you would have to look for pictures, but here they actually tell you. The first amphibians appeared in the Devonian period. And then where did the first flowering plants appear? You would look here, and that would be in the Cretaceous period. Then, in which geological period have we done that? The amphibians first appeared in the Devonian. Then, what do we term the event that occurred 543 million years ago? And that is, right at the start, that would be the Cambrian Explosion. Okay, next one. During which period did the mass extinction occur that wiped out the dinosaurs? And that was at the end of the Cretaceous, the extinction of the dinosaurs. So that would have been 65 million years ago. And then discuss one theory that scientists put forward. Okay, so that would be the Cretaceous. And then one of the theory that scientists put forward, which would be the asteroid impact, volcanic action, or climate change. And you would need to not just name the theories, but actually explain a little bit about how they would have led to a mass extinction. Let's have a look at another type of question that can be asked. In this diagram, you are shown a section through rock layers with different types of fossils like dinosaur bones, fish, mollusks, things like that. And these are on the side of a valley. And one thing you can pick up straight away is that if you look at those common fossils, which are index fossils, remember, you find them in the same layer on the opposite side of the valley. These ones, no fossils. We don't know why. Let's have a look at the questions. Which layers of rock are probably the same age? And that would be rock U and Y. And why? Because they have the same fossils in them. Sometimes you might be asked to add on to that question, why do you say that they are probably the same age? And then you would talk about having the same fossils. Then, W and X, that's those ones there, are also sedimentary rock layers, but they don't have any fossils. What could be the possible reason for there being no fossils? First of all, you must remember that 99% of living organisms don't form fossils. Fossils are only formed when conditions are just right. So the most common explanation would be that the conditions for fossilization weren't good. Another answer you could give is that the organisms were microscopic, so you couldn't see them, or the organisms were soft-bodied, and we know that soft-bodied organisms generally don't form fossils. Okay, next question. State whether the following statements is true or false. First one, older fossils in deeper rocks. I would say that's a good bet. True. Second one, the deeper the rock, the more different types of fossils. That is obviously false. Next one, the fossils above, which is in the picture, indicate that the area was once an inland sea. Fish skeletons, mollusks, shells. So that gives us a good idea that it was an inland sea because those are aquatic organisms. And the next one, the older organisms that fossilize are more complex in nature. Most definitely not, because when we looked at the geological time scale, where were the simplest organisms? The simplest organisms were at the bottom, and the more complex organisms were near the top. Next question is use a flow diagram to describe how fossils have been formed. And this is one of the things that you do need to know off by heart, the steps of fossilization. In this particular example, you're asked to do it as a flow diagram. And a flow diagram is a series of statements separated by arrows. For example, and this is the first one given to you, the organism dies and sinks to the bottom of an inland sea. So, what happens next after the organism has died? Soft parts decay, covered by sediment. The sediments are compacted into rock. More sediments are laid down. And important point for a fossil, the plant or animal remains must become mineralized over many, many years. If they're covered by sediments and they're not mineralized, they actually don't form fossils. Then, at some time, the surface would erode and the fossils would be exposed so that we can find them and wonder about how they came to be. Now, before your minds get too muddled, we need to take a break. See you later. Welcome back to our life sciences lesson on the history of life. What we're going to be looking at now is mass extinctions. In geological time, there have been 5 mass extinctions at different points in the geological time scale. And if we have a look here, it's the okay, so I do starting from this one.
Yeah, if we have a look here and then we tend to go right, then we can pick up from there.
Oh, okay, so from turning, I'd already given the introduction to mass extinctions.
Yeah.
Through what's on the board. If we have a look at all these mass extinctions, you can read first one, end Ordovician, its time, the Devonian period, when it occurred, the end Permian period. And remember, this is the one that caused the greatest die-off, the end Triassic, which is when the dinosaurs became extinct. Oh no, that wasn't when the dinosaurs became extinct. This was when the dinosaurs became extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. And interestingly enough, all of these mass extinctions ended one of the periods in the geological timescale. Now, what causes mass extinctions? And in a previous lesson, we looked at some of the most important theories, and I'm just going to briefly revise them for you. Okay, first one, asteroid, volcano, or climate change. First one, the asteroid impact. An asteroid hit the Earth in the Gulf of Mexico, causing widespread chaos, climate change, volcanic action, dust in the air, all sorts of difficulties for life. Another popular theory or accepted theory is volcanic action, where the movement of the tectonic plates formed huge volcanic eruptions where the Earth tore apart, oozing liquid lava over large areas. Third one is climate change, in which either global cooling or global warming could happen. But the most common ones, of course, the 5 ice ages, which have occurred in the history of the Earth, with decrease in sea levels, death of plants, death of animals, etc. Then, you're also familiar with this. It has a look at how many different species there are, how many different families there are over time, and each time there is a drop, it shows when a mass extinction is occurring, and the biggest mass extinction is the one which was at the end of the Permian period. But remember, mass extinctions kill off many animals, but they also open up habitats for other animals to survive. Most of the questions on the geological timescale are interpretation, to see if you can answer questions and extract information from a geological timescale. There are many different versions of geological timescale, but they all give you the same basic information. So don't be thrown off if you get a geological timescale which looks slightly different. It will still be giving you the same information, and you can interpret it in exactly the same way. First question. On the next slide, there is a graph showing the change in the number of marine animal species, and it's shown on the geological timescale with the mass extinctions and pictures of animals. So this is quite a complex diagram, and it gives you quite a bit of information. So before we even start looking at the questions, let's work out, what is this actually telling us? What information is it giving us? Firstly, at the bottom, there is the geological timescale with our millions of years. On the y-axis is biodiversity, shown by the number of different families, the number of different groups of organisms. The actual graph itself you should be familiar with because it's something we've just looked at. It shows the change in diversity, and it indicates our major mass extinctions. It also shows the names of the different periods at the bottom, And what this shows, which none of the other ones we've looked at so far, it actually shows us some of the animals or plants that were most affected by those mass extinctions. For example, trilobites, which became extinct. Ammonoids, the nautilus, which became extinct. With something like this, once you've worked out what it's telling you, the next thing is, what are the questions? Okay, and the first one says, for each extinction, identify the period and the approximate date in which it occurred. Okay, so you look for the dips, and there we have the Ordovician extinction, the date, probably about 440 million years ago. Then we have the Devonian extinction, ending the Devonian period. That's probably 3,600 years ago. So all you need to do is you need to actually just have a look, see where the dips are, and then go to the time period at the bottom, and you will also be able to find out which periods were actually involved. So, if we have a look at the answers, there are 5 mass extinctions. First one is at the end of the Ordovician. And we usually talk about the end of a particular period. We never say it happened at the beginning of a different period. The end Devonian and the time scale, the end of the Permian one. Remember, this was the big one when the most animals became extinct. The end of the Triassic, and then the end of the Cretaceous when the dinosaurs became extinct, which was 650 million years ago. Next question. Which extinction caused the greatest decrease in biodiversity? And from what we've done, we know that that is the Permian extinction, the extinction at the end of the Permian. Then, how many marine families were actually killed off in the end Cretaceous extinction? So you find the end Cretaceous extinction, which is here, and you have a look at more or less how many different families disappeared, and that is about Oh, of course, because I was drawing there. Okay. Yeah. So, if we have a look, it's probably about 1,000 families, and some of the examples were the ammonites, marine reptiles, etc. And you can get all of that information actually from the geological timescale. Then, other questions to see if you can read off what the timescale tells you. How long ago did the trilobites become extinct? You find the trilobites, and you have a look at when did the trilobites become extinct? Round about there, 360 million years ago. Then the next question says compare the number of marine families at the beginning of the Cambrian period to those which exist today. Okay, so we have a look. There's the beginning of the Cambrian period where there were just about 110 families with the ones which exist today. And if we have a look, that is over 1,900 families. Then the second part of the question says, what does this indicate? This huge increase in diversity of marine families. And that indicates that because there's such a difference in the number of families, more families must have developed, and that is one of the pieces of evidence which scientists use for the evolution, the change and the diversification of animals over time. Okay. Okay.
And 3, 2, 1.
Now, before your brains burn out, maybe we need a break. Welcome back to our revision lesson on the history of life. We're going to carry on looking at some different types of questions that you can be asked on this particular section. Many of these questions have got quite a complicated introduction, but you just need to underline, okay, it's a bar graph, and the thickness of the bars represent the number of different types of animals. And the bottom of the bars indicate the period when that group arose. So let's actually have a look at this diagram. On the side here, we've basically got our geological time scale with some years that are given. At the bottom is a variety of different living organisms, and what these purple things are, it's like a bar, it's almost like a bar graph, but what happens is the width of the bar actually gives you an indication of the biodiversity. In other words, how many different types of mollusks. And if we have a look, what I've just been outlining is mollusks, and there's actually quite a lot of different types of mollusks. If we have a look here, echinoderms, those are sea urchins, and there are not a lot of different types of that. Okay, so it's looking at how many animals of each different type existed. And as you'll notice that as we go up the geological time scale, the size of the bars changes. Okay, and one of the biggest change in the size of the bars occurs here at the end of the Permian period. And we shouldn't be surprised at that, because we already know that at the end of the Permian period, there was this huge mass extinction which killed off many different types of species. Now, what can you be expected to extract from a diagram like this? So let's have a look at the questions which could be asked. Okay, first of all, simple reading off the graph. Which 3 animal groups show the greatest diversity at the present time? So the present time, that's the line at the top, all the way along. And we're looking for the ones which show the greatest diversity, and that is chordates, which are vertebrates, mollusks, and arthropods. The next question asks, which animal group became extinct during the Paleozoic era? So we go to the graph, and then we have a look. Here is the Paleozoic era. If an animal group has become extinct, it means the lines will stop, and there's only one group of animals that was present during the Paleozoic period, which is not present now, and they are called graptolites. Now, you don't need to know anything about them. You don't need to know what they look like. You just need to be able to extract the information from the source material you were given. The next question, which animal group arose most recently? So we have a look, and remember this is geological time. Which animal group arose most recently? And that is the chordates, or the vertebrate group. All the other groups of animals were present much, much earlier. So that's the chordates, which is the vertebrate group. Next question. Which two animal groups arose in the Cambrian period? So you need to find the Cambrian period and find out which two animal groups arose in the Cambrian period. And if we have a look here, right at the bottom of the Cambrian period, in the beginning, when invertebrates were ruling what Earth was like at that time, those are the mollusks and the arthropods. Those are the earliest groups that arose. Next, what effect did the mass extinction at the end of the Permian have on most of the animal groups? So we have a look, there's our mass extinction at the end of the Permian, and if you have a look, almost every animal group narrowed at that particular time. The group which seemed to have the least effect on was the chordates or the vertebrates. So what effect? It reduced the diversity. In other words, it reduced the number of different types of animals of that group on Earth. Then another question, also you can extract directly from the graph, which group has had the most consistent diversity? Now, the most consistent diversity means it hasn't had very, very big bulges and very, very narrow parts. So you have a look at the group which has the bar which actually varies the least. And if you have a look, that's them, the sponges. They have, probably because they live in water, they have not been as badly affected as some of the other groups. Then, next question. You'll notice that most of these questions are linked to the geological timescale. They just show different aspects. Okay? And this one is similar to the previous one. It's also looking at the different time periods, except this is looking at the development of the vertebrate groups. The different types of vertebrates, for example, reptiles, fish, amphibians, birds, and mammals. And again, the width of the column refers to the number of species. So the wider the column, the more variety there is. And if you turn your head sideways, it's actually quite similar to the previous question that we had a look at. Before we even start looking at the questions, this gives us an indication of how many different reptiles were present in the Mesozoic era. It also gives us an indication when birds actually arose, because birds arose in the Mesozoic era. They weren't present before then. It also shows us that the amphibians, at the end of the Paleozoic era, amphibians had a wide diversity, but things have changed since then because they now have fewer different types. So once you've understood what this source material is telling you, we can have a look at a little bit more detail of that. So this is just a bigger picture so that you can see a little bit more clearly what is actually going on. Now, let's look at the questions. Starting off with an easy question. Time is measured in the unit MYA. And what does this stand for? Million years ago. Then, looking at the graph, it says which group of vertebrates is the oldest. And if you have a look, the group which originated earlier, before all the others, that is obviously the fish. Then, which group currently has the least, and that is the thickness there, that's the amphibian group, and which group currently has the most different species, and that is the mammals, and we know they have the most different species because their bar is the widest. Next question. Which groups existed on Earth during the Paleozoic era? And you know, if you get a question like this, draw lines all over it because it helps you work out which animals were present. So if we look at this, if we draw a line at the end of the Paleozoic era, which three organisms were present? Fish, amphibians, and not a lot, but there were some reptiles. Then, if we have a look, birds are the ones that have been around for the least amount of time. And that shows that is when birds developed. So birds developed sometime in the middle of the Mesozoic era, at the beginning of the Cretaceous period. And scientists actually think birds evolved from ancestors which were like dinosaurs. Then again, looking at the graph, which group was the most abundant at the beginning of the Cretaceous period? We draw a line, and that's obviously the reptiles. Then, which group was not present in the early Cretaceous? That's the birds. And which animal group had the lowest diversity at the end of the Cretaceous? And remember, lowest diversity at the end of the Cretaceous, it means the narrowest bar. And that was the reptiles. Then, lastly, which groups of vertebrates developed from the common ancestor? Okay, those lines linking the different groups together, they're referring to those common ancestors, like the fossils we talked about as transitional fossils. And from that common ancestor, there are three groups developing, namely mammals, birds, and reptiles. Hopefully by now you're getting the hang of this, because there's one more different type of question that we need to have a look at. And we're going to have a look at it now. Okay, this particular, it's also a graph, and it shows the rate of extinction. In other words, how many organisms became extinct at a particular time. So it's also got the geological time scale along the bottom, but this time it's a graph, and the graph shows the rate of extinction. In other words, how many families became extinct. And if we have a look, there are peaks in the extinction rate, and these peaks obviously correlate with our mass extinctions, because that's what the definition of a mass extinction is. Many species become extinct at the same time. You can be asked to read information off the graph. Okay, first of all, it says identify the era with the shortest duration. So if we have a look here, obviously, shortest duration is the Cenozoic era. Is this the... Okay. Okay, so we...
Let's just go back so that we can review the answer.
Okay. So,
You just want to end with that one because the time is up.
oh,
Yes. So you can do the rest of those answers.
those three. Okay, and then I just tell them that there are more questions, but it will be in the notes accompanying this video.
Okay. And 3, 2, 1.
Shortest duration, the Cenozoic period. The longest duration, the Paleozoic era. And the era with the fewest geological periods is the Cenozoic era. Now, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but there are some more questions that are on the notes that will accompany this recording. So please have a look. All the answers are there as well. I sincerely hope that you have found my explanations helpful, and when you get to exams, you will find the History of Life section very easy to do. See you next time.